Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I know this is the end of 3 fabulous days with lots of stimulation and lots of things running around your brain, and I commend you for coming to hear the wonderful Linda Fairstein. I have known Linda since the 1970s, and I will tell you, much to my dismay, that it was only yesterday that I learned it was Linda Fairstein, and I have been calling her Linda Fairstein since the 1970s, and everyone always calls me Rikki Klieman, and I'm Rikki Klieman. So the best thing you can think of now is we will answer to either one.
Anything.
Linda has had 2 remarkable careers, one as a lawyer, another as a writer. And I'm going to attempt, within the time allowed, to divide the time, first to her work as a lawyer and then to her work as a writer. And I'm going to attempt to give you a couple minutes at the end for some Q&A, but a lot of material in Linda's life. Linda's also a great mentor for women, and she was an extraordinary influence on the lives of young women lawyers, including mine. And sometime over a cup of coffee or cocktails, I can tell you all the wonderful things that she did for me and others in our lives to help our own careers. So let's start going back to the 1970s. There were almost no women in the law. I had the good fortune of doing a project at Frank Hogan's district attorney's office, which was New York County, or what we know as Manhattan. And there came this woman who everyone wanted to watch. And she grew into being the head of the sex crimes unit at a time when, you will recall, in order to prosecute a rape case, you had to have corroboration. So if someone said, I was raped, but they hadn't screamed out, I'm being a little colloquial here, they hadn't screamed out to have someone else hear them, that their word would not suffice. And time changed over your own time. So I want to go back to a few of the celebrated cases that you had that I really think made a difference in how cases were prosecuted. So let's start.
I'm going to interrupt you.
You may.
Only to say thank you for doing this, and I hope when we come back, when Jamie has us, we can reverse the tables so I can tell you the wonderful things about Rikki Klieman and the career she's had and the kind of friend that she has been. And I also want to say, because of her introduction, when I went to law school at the University of Virginia, where I met Jamie, my husband, I see one of the, maybe there were 15 of us or 18 women in our entering class, and Molly Sumner, raise your hand, who's from your community, is one of them. So we went very different paths, but I commend you too, and wonderful to see you. Okay, ready.
There were only, I think, 7% in the 1970s of people in law school who were women. Now they are over 50%. Pretty amazing. Let's start with some of the ones that really made a difference for the whole country, because these things had not been prosecuted before. And Marvin Teichner really strikes me because, as they say, people didn't believe it was true. Tell us about that case.
So I was asked to take over the newly formed sex crimes unit in 1976. And the next year, a man was arrested. He was a dentist. He was a very prominent dentist in Manhattan, been practicing for 30 years. And literally, I mean, you'd have to go back in time when you're educated by SVU and other things to remember what Rikki was talking about, that the word of a woman was not legally sufficient to take a case to court. And so a young woman walked into a police station in Chelsea, Lower West Side, and said that she came out of sedation at her dentist's office, and her clothing was in disarray, and she had discomfort in the lower part of her body, and she believed the dentist had molested her while she was under sedation. So the detective took the case seriously, went to Dr. Teicher's office. Teicher pulls out a brochure that says, the drug I used is hallucinogenic, causes hallucinations. The detective went back, was very, very empathic to the victim, but said, here's your literature, causes hallucinations, can't do anything with this case. 6 months later, another woman, same police station, one detective sends it back to the first one, and he said, didn't even have to leave his desk, it's hallucinogenic. Third time, the detective called me and said, there must be something in the water or this guy's got a problem. And so we actually did the first time anywhere in the country, did the equivalent of a wiretap in a mob movie, where you need to get a court order to conceal an audio taping somewhere in a social club or a restaurant. Audio wouldn't do it because we didn't know if the dentist said anything, but we needed a video camera. And it was the first time a case that went up to the Supreme Court to allow the video camera. And the detectives went in, a legal break-in. There would happen to be an air conditioning duct right over the dental chair. They concealed the camera. The hardest part of the episode, for a little humor, was finding a female detective, young female detective, with an abscessed tooth. We needed him to sedate her, use something that would put her out. And very, very brave young woman agreed to go in. Her partner pretended to be the boyfriend in the waiting area. The dentist put her under and pulled the wrong tooth, we think in his rush to get to her, and then lifted her out of the chair and began to caress her. We weren't waiting for anything more than that. Nobody needed her to be raped. And so the detective went in, lowered her in the chair, and he very calmly said, I was resuscitating my patient. She'd been in respiratory distress. End of story is that the case was tried. The older defense attorney, when there were only women, very few women in the courtroom, as we keep saying, was Henry Rothblatt, who made the mistake of calling the woman judge dear and sweetie and honey, waived a jury, and the judge ruled that squeezing the buttocks of a woman was not a known means of respiratory recovery, and convicted him. And it was the first time nationally, and it was a case that went all the way up, that people began to take seriously the idea that healthcare professionals could also be sex offenders, that they didn't hide behind trees in a park or, come out of the darkness to get you. So that was a major turning point, both in investigating the case creatively with the NYPD and making law.
In that this was a whole area that hadn't been explored before, one of the other things that you went forward with, and this is in the general sense, was date rape. We all had a belief system in society that rape only occurred in the way Linda just described. Someone jumps out of an alley, pulls you in, but the idea of quote-unquote date rape didn't exist. So how did you manage to make that change? That was a total shift in society.
Complete shift. We found with this new unit that young women, a lot of women, older too, but mostly young middle-aged women, were coming to us and describing that they had been on a date or in a study group. I mean, it was always a known acquaintance. I always used to say it was not a problem for the NYPD to identify who the guy was. Sometimes the woman didn't even know the name of the guy, but she knew he lived in 2D on in the building on East 79th Street. And because these cases, the law still said the word of the woman is not enough. If she said she'd been overcome by force, her life had been threatened, but she wasn't injured, hadn't gone to a hospital right away, there was no way to prove beyond her word that these things occurred. So we began not only to fight to change the law, but we began to try to experiment with these cases and take the best of them and try and could make up corroboration, but try and stretch when she first told somebody. There wasn't an eyewitness, but was there an immediate outcry? And that was acceptable in the law. We helped hospitals create special nurses, forensic nurses, safe examiners, they would call it, sexual assault forensic examiners, to do the exams, to know what to look for in a patient and record it and document it. In 1977, I tried the first of those in our unit that resulted in a conviction. And we began to encourage women to come in. And just a jump ahead side note, it's fascinating to me that during COVID, that's one of the few categories of crime that went down in New York and almost everywhere because there was less socializing. People weren't going to parties and having a guy say, I'll take you home, or meeting in a bar, or meeting at the library and saying, let's go for a drink, and then what happens. But that was something very few places in the country were willing to prosecute. And then as word got out, all over the country, LA, offices everywhere would call and say, how do you do it? What's the protocol? I mean, we had no template. And that's what I loved about the colleagues I had in the office and the Special Victims Unit of the NYPD. They were willing to be experimental and to try things that would get these cases into the courtroom. And it was a very slow breakthrough through the mid-'80s, began to steamroll after that.
Really revolutionary. You had a case with a person named Russell West. Really a frightening creature.
Very frightening. So there was a series, many times in New York City history, there have been cases, pattern cases, where the police know it's 3 or more crimes have been committed by the same individual. It's almost like a fingerprint. He uses the same weapon. The approach is usually the same. The language during the crime is the same. And so when the pattern is developed, the pattern expert at Special Victims would come to us, start investigating the case. So we had a guy who was called the East Side Rapist. And I said, we've had many East Side rapists, but this was a pattern in 1985, and there were 18 cases committed, and this guy was so smart and escaped so well, and it was before DNA. It was just before DNA. So we had a couple of cases, but he wore gloves, so we didn't have fingerprints. And out of the one night, the case was on the news, and the cases were happening, by the way. My CBS legal analyst friend, CBS used to own the building called BlackRock on 52nd Street. It happened in the BlackRock building. It happened in the Pan Am building over Grand Central Terminal. This guy was going into fancy office buildings, getting past security, raping young women, raping elderly women. The elevator doors would open, he'd grab someone and pull them in or out, and the crime would occur. And one day, I mean, we're stumped, and one day a retired detective called us, and he said, you know, I had a sexual assault in the BlackRock building of CBS 12 years ago. And the sketch I'm seeing on the street looks a lot like the sketch of my guy. And my guy's name was Russell West. And the detectives, didn't take them overnight. They pulled the Russell West file from some of the same buildings, same locations, entirely the same modus operandi from 12 years earlier. And it was this exact same Russell West. They waited for him, fingerprinted him, and he was responsible for 18, maybe 12 rapes the first time, 12 years earlier, and 18 rapes. And so the serial rapists can be frighteningly prolific, made somewhat easier now by DNA technology, because it's hard to commit a sexual assault without leaving some kind of trace evidence in or around the victim or in the apartment.
One of the cases you're most famous for is called the Preppy murder case, and I'm sure that many of you in the audience have heard of it. Robert Chambers. He was a difficult defendant to prosecute because on the surface, if you looked at him, he was very appealing.
a huge problem that I'd never anticipated or encountered before. Jennifer Levin was the murder victim in 1986, and Robert had been a friend of hers, and the kids were all going off to college. It was August. Everybody was going off except Robert, who'd been thrown out of college. He had a serious drug problem. He'd been to Hazelden. He flunked out of Hazelden, and so all the kids were together at a bar in New York called Dorian's Red Hand, which I hate to say thrived because the murder acquaintances had gathered there that night. It used to make me crazy when I would go home at night before the trial that there were hundreds of kids lined up around the block waiting to get in because of the notoriety, in a bad sense, of the meeting place. And so the police got down to about 4 people who'd been in the bar at 3 in the morning when Robert and Jennifer left together consensually and went to Central Park. The original police theory was that her body was found right behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art by a biker at 6 in the morning, and the police thought, in cop language, that it had been a dump job, meaning she'd been killed somewhere else and dumped in the park, because who would walk into Central Park at 3 in the morning for a social sexual encounter? In any event, the last friends at the bar said the last person to leave with her was Robert. They went to Robert's home on East 90th Street. His mother said he's sleeping, and police said we'd like to talk to him. When he came to the front door, he had scratches on his face, described as, we had pictures of them, industrial. I mean, it looked like he'd been scraped by pieces of metal, which had been Jennifer fighting for her life. And police said, the scratches. And he said, my cat clawed me. And as I just learned about California last night at dinner, can't declaw cats here. Well, his cat was declawed, so the police knew that wasn't a viable story, took him into the precinct, and he admitted causing Jennifer's death, but said it was an accident, in an expression that became kind of the code word for the case, that they were having rough sex. And he actually had to pull at her to stop hurting him. She was 5'7", 120, and he was 6'4", 210. But she was hurting him. So the biggest problem we had was that we couldn't prove intent. They went off together. It was not a premeditated crime. What turned bad in the park, and what became the social problem was everybody I'd talked to at a dinner party, in a taxi cab, on my way home from work, my polling were the cab drivers at midnight. And what are you doing here so late? Well, I'm working on a case. What kind of case? And I'd say the name, and they'd say, oh, that good-looking kid? Well, why would he have to do that to anybody? And he was dressed up to come to court. I mean, he was just dressed elegantly. He was photographed on the cover of New York Magazine with a rep tie and blazer, and
he looked perfect.
He looked perfect. He looked perfect. He acted. He would try to hold the door open for me to the courtroom. And as soon as I realized that's what he was doing, so a reporter could snap that picture, I said to the judge, "You got to find me another way into the courtroom. I got to go in the jury entrance, so that just some other way." And it was a very difficult case to try. The medical evidence, in part, made it very difficult. The first medical examiner had never had an asphyxial case before, strangulation. And so she said she thought it took only 20 seconds to occur. And my friend, our friend, a great defense attorney, called when I said yesterday at our panel, do what Rikki would think to do. This guy called the country's 3 leading asphyxial experts before I could even get to that task or thought of getting to that task. And I ended up getting one who didn't believe the defense theory, but that kind of death with a struggle causing asphyxia, 4 to 5 minutes. So this girl fought for her life for 4 to 5 minutes. And the jury hung because one of the young women on the jury, we are told by other jurors, liked Robert Chambers.
She was dazzled.
She was dazzled. At the end of the day, the clerk would try and collect the evidence that had been in the jury room, and they'd all joke and say, "Did you keep his phone number? Give it back." The jury hung after 9 days, and the defendant, for reasons I will never know, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 15 years in jail. He was 19 without a criminal history, or without a criminal record, but with a criminal history, and got out, did the full 15, got out, and is back in jail now, probably till he'll be 60, because he was selling drugs. Again, a great NYPD undercover job. Things had advanced to the point where they had cameras installed in a button on their shirt, the NYPD, and got photographs of him doing 3 buys, which was the minimum for an arrest they needed for felony drugs, and he's in jail.
That was at a time when DNA, too, was thought to be unreliable, right?
Oh, how could I forget that? That was the first time that I tried to use DNA in a case. The medical examiner called me and said, "This is new science, new technology." It wasn't brand new, but new forensically, called DNA. You really need to... we have nobody in our medical examiner's office who is up on it, but you need to learn it. I drove out to Suffolk County a few nights a week. Charles Hirsch, who later became our medical examiner, tutored me in DNA. We brought the FBI in. We sent the evidence down. We had Robert's blood on Jennifer's clothing. We had her blood on some of his clothing. And we had a 3-week hearing just on admitting DNA. It was one of the first in the country. It had never been admitted in New York before. I'm not sure any other state. And the judge said, "This will never fly. This science is unreliable. I'm not going to let you use it." So the jury never heard that her denim jacket had been placed over her mouth, the first part of the suffocation, with his blood on the edges of the jacket, and her blood, she was bleeding from the mouth where she'd been punched, on the inner side of the jacket. The jury was never allowed to hear that, our best proof of murder.
It's interesting because DNA evidence was what we called junk science in those days, that you had to show a judge that what was unknown science had over time gotten to a level that it was accepted as being state of the art. And for those of you who may remember, at O.J. Simpson's trial, there was a hearing that lasted weeks on end about whether or not they would admit DNA evidence, because even in 1995, it was still questionable. Now, of course, as we know with DNA, it's the gold standard. There's only 1 in 5 trillion jillion people who would have that DNA.
And this was 87,
right, long
before O.J. Simpson. And Robin Cotton, the same DNA expert who testified for the prosecution in Simpson, and I thought was brilliant, I think put the jury to sleep. And she had testified for us, and she was just one of the earliest scientists to use it, one of the first women in DNA forensics, and the judge just not there.
You really became a model, if not the model, for Law and Order SVU. You were also asked to do some work or consulting to be able to help, and I'll never get it right, it's like Fairstein, Mariska Haggerty, who has the role in Law and Order SVU. Tell us about that experience. I mean, that really... You really created a genre on television, even though you didn't intend that.
No, I did. Dick Wolf was the genius, as he is behind many of those crime shows, and he called the mothership the original Law and Order with Sam Waterston. And he began to follow our sex crimes unit cases, thought they were really interesting. I had always thought they were not going to work in prime time. I didn't think people would really be able to handle a steady diet of this issue at that hour of the night, and Dick Wolf thought differently. And so he called and told me he was doing it. He said, "I'm taking your unit. I don't need you for stories. I'm going to rip them from the headlines. I didn't get paid. I wouldn't have been allowed to take money, but he didn't offer to have me leave the job and do it. But he said, "Love you to meet Mariska Hargitay," and who's now in her 24th year. And Stephanie March was Alex Cabot, the first young prosecutor for 10 years. And can they shadow you? Can they follow you around? Can they spend time? And the DA said, sure. And nobody thought this was going to be a project that lasted more than a year or two. And what I love about it is it put our issues on the map in a way that people who wouldn't read about these cases in the newspaper, didn't necessarily want the facts of the true stories and the heartbreaking true stories, would watch them as fiction. And Mariska played the role like nobody else. She's the detective. Stephanie was the DA, and it's just become synonymous with her career. And she gives back. She became very involved with a couple of victim services agencies, founded her own foundation. I think the biggest part of which has been helping get backlogged rape evidence collection kits off shelves, if you know that issue, which is a sad one around the country, and closing, as we did with the NYPD, cold cases that happened 16, 18, 20 years ago, where the evidence had been preserved in the police storage units. So the show's done a very good job for the issue, for taking the issue, as I always say, out of the darkness and into the light. And I'm no richer for it, but they
but you
tell
have
a good
satisfaction.
story. Yeah, a lot of satisfaction.
She was great. I had sat on the board of the Rape Treatment Center in Los Angeles when my husband was chief of police, and she would come to conferences to teach police officers how to talk with victims of sexual assault. She really was she was inspirational.
She's inspirational. She got it and really truly believes it and believes in giving back. Her mother, as some of you from this community may know or remember, was Jane Mansfield. And her father, Mickey Hargitay, he was kind of the Arnold Schwarzenegger of his day. He was a Hungarian bodybuilding weightlifter who married Jane Mansfield, and she's a wonderful, wonderful human being.
Well, you gave of your career that created this amazing show. So I want to talk about your second career. I don't know how many of you have read the Alexandra Cooper novels. I commend them. They're in that world of mysteries and thrillers. They are, as I would say, unputdownable. I've always had a deep and abiding desire to write a novel, and I can't. I mean, I try, but somehow they always start to become nonfiction. I mean, I intend them to be fiction, and ultimately they're nonfiction, and I don't want to talk about a lot of the things in my own life for bed reading, pleasure, or beach reading. So I wish I could do what you have done. And I want to know, what was the process where, I mean, here you are practicing law, you're a prosecutor, you're there till 2002, and you somehow make a decision that you're going to write a novel. And the first one was Final Jeopardy.
Yes.
These novels, many of them have been New York Times bestsellers, and people love them. They love her. So first is, how did you decide you were going to do it? And then secondly is, please tell me how you did this.
Okay. So the funny thing that you just said about yourself, not wanting to put yourself, enough of your personal features into somebody's bed reading or beach reading, is a really good point. And I thought about that creating the character at first, and I knew I wanted to do, I had the real job, and I felt that what I could do differently in the crime genre was show the inside work of that job. And I made some changes. The characters, younger, thinner, blonder, as I've said many times. but I gave her a trust fund because I needed her, while single, to have a house on Martha's Vineyard that I only got when I was married. And so I did all of these things to change her personal life. And boy, do you begin to hear from people you grew up with, like, I never knew you had a trust fund. I mean, I didn't know your father invented that medical valve that's used in every cardiac operation. I said, well, those parts are not true.
I didn't know that you ran through the bowels of Rockefeller University in fear of your life. Right?
Well, no, but I did walk through them. The great thing, I mean, there's an NYPD detective or 10 heading security at kind of every landmark location you want to be in New York. And RockU is a guy named Michael Murphy who said, I'll take you anywhere you want to go. You want to go underground? And it's not pleasant in the bowels. I didn't run scared for my life, but I go everywhere that the character goes in the 20 books. So, because I love making New York City landmarks sort of part of the theme of every book. So they're not just chases and shootouts and gore. I mean, I want the reader to learn a little bit about something real, and in this case, New York City history. So they're set in different landmark locations, as Rikki knows, in different parts of New York. And I since I'd been a kid, long before I had a dream of going to law school, I wanted to write. I love, if any of you heard part of Fran Lebowitz, I've always loved books, like Fran was talking about. I've always loved reading. I was sort of drawn to the crime genre early. My mother couldn't read my own books. We were very close, and she loved me, but she'd get to page 4 and hear, because they're written in the first person, she'd hear me telling the story. And she'd like close, but did you really do that? Did you go there? Were you? But my father gave me this gene. I mean, from putting Sherlock Holmes in my hands, from putting Edgar Allan Poe in my hands. So I always loved crime novels, and I was very attracted to the series crime novels that a lot of people whose books line these shelves do. And again, what I thought I could do that was different was recreate the job of a prosecutor in an unusual world and present that.
So when you wrote the first novel, Final Jeopardy, you saw it as the beginning of a series.
That was my dream, yes, that I could do a series, and to my great advantage, it was sold after I'd only written 96 pages. And there was actually a bidding war, to be obnoxious, between 3 good publishers. And Scribner, where I wound up, said...
Not obnoxious, just really terrific.
No, well, thank you. You're generous, as always. The people at Scribner said, well, do you think you could do 2 of these? Well, shall we make it a 2-book contract? And I said, I think I can do 10. And they said, okay, let's start with 2 and 2 again. And I can remember getting to 10 and thinking that whole dream came true. I mean, I just, with a lot of work, because I was doing it while I was still in the DA's office till 2002, as Rikki told you. I got my first contract in 1994, and Final Jeopardy came out in 96. So with the district attorney's permission, because as he frequently told me, these aren't going to go anywhere, I would use all my free time. I get up early before I went to work, 5, 6 o'clock, and try and write for an hour. And weekends was writing. Summer vacation was writing, because I liked doing it. I liked being able to tell the story, and I like to read mysteries. So it was amazing to me that I could be in that world and write them, and still do both. And they were slow to come at the beginning, because the prosecutorial job was much more important, was often 24/7. And when something happened that was a case for one of my young colleagues to be handling, the writing was a second career. That went by the side.
You also did, I think it's 3 books that were for school kids.
Yes.
So we have Linda Fairstein, prosecutor, Linda Fairstein, now best-selling novelist, and now we have a give back. That's a different kind of writing.
Totally different. And I have to say, if you're ever going to be interviewed, rule number one, have a friend do it. Have somebody you like and trust, because you'll never be treated this generously again.
Well, the game here is not stump the guest.
Right, okay.
The game here is give you information, right?
Okay, thank you. I loved Nancy Drew as a kid. Older brother, Hardy Boys first. Then, wow, there's a girl doing this kind of thing. And I really wanted to bring that kind of thing up to date. So I wrote 3 books for middle grade kids, or 9 to 12. Character's name is Devlin Quick, and she's a New York City kid. So very different than Nancy Drew living in River Oaks, I think it was, and riding in the Roadster with the boyfriend. This is a subway kid. And the other liberty I took, I hope I'm forgiven, I made her mother the police commissioner of New York City, because we built
long before there was a woman police commissioner, which doesn't
new
happen
now. But after my dear friend and most respected colleague Bill Bratton left us twice, so that opened a whole other range of things that I could have the kid do when she needed to do facial recognition software, because she thought she saw the thief in the library. She was able to convince, while her mother was out on the job, convince one of the mother's assistants to let her into the facial recognition software computers. And so I used both worlds, which made it a lot of fun. Different and hard because you have to know the language of 12, 13, 14-year-olds, which was very different. And I found myself having dinner with friends, and every time they'd say, this is what their 8th grader was doing, and this was the skateboarding word that I used in chapter 1 of the first book. I mean, I thought it was like finding the Rosetta Stone and having a whole new language coming to me. And I always had a pen and paper and would just jot down what that word or those words would be. And because the book had to read the right way for kids.
Let alone the fact of if you were writing those books today, all the words you could not use, all the phrases you would not be able to use.
Correct. I'm sure somebody's gone back and edited those out.
No, because it's like trying to have a conversation, if you're our age, with young women who are Generation Z. Do we have any Generation Zs here, back in the back? That it's like learning a new language.
Yes.
So you were wise to take notes along the way.
Oh, yeah.
I want to talk a little bit before we run out of time, because I think it's something that people don't know. Prosecutorial discretion in sexual assault cases, because this also can come up for Alexandra Cooper. Sure. Someone comes in, or many people come in, and say that they were sexually assaulted, and you believe them, and that you can see that the case is ultimately not going to work. There are just too many legal hurdles or evidentiary hurdles. So what happens in those situations?
Sure. Great question. I'll give you 2 different examples. One is the kind of investigation where you end up, nobody wants to hear this if they've been the real victim of a crime, that the victim is not telling the truth. And again, as I said yesterday on the panel that we were on, you think of the best defense attorney and you think what the questions are. And people lie about every kind of crime, but there are reasons that people will make up a sexual assault. And I've always thought it's the ugliest thing you can do, because the next real victim that presents herself, the next 10 real victims that present herself to an NYPD officer, that guy's going to say, the last one wasn't telling the truth. How do I trust this one? And we really developed skills and trained our assistants. There was nothing more important than getting the truth. And I would say the last place I want to hear the real story is in the courtroom,
Right.
when my adversary cross-examines you and brings out things that you haven't told me or that you've been dishonest about. So I used to say that, and still hold, that one of the things I'm proudest of in our record was exonerating people who were falsely charged with the crime. The other is a much bigger problem. Many of the cases, especially acquaintance cases, involve alcohol and drug use. And people would come in and tell a story, and one of my colleagues used to say, well, if a young woman told you she had 3 drinks, multiply it by 2. Multiply whatever the number is by 2, because there was a chance she... So, of course, you can't make that up, and you can't guess that. But I'd always say, what do you think he's going to say? Oh, well, he's going to lie, and he's going to say, I had a bottle of champagne after I finished XYZ drinks. We had a case at the West End Bar, which used to be the big Columbia University bar on Broadway, and the young woman was drinking a drink called a fishbowl. And I said, what's a fishbowl? And she said, well, literally, they serve you a fishbowl. And I'd say, what was in it? I don't know, whatever the bartender put in it. And then, give us a straw, and 3 of us would share the fishbowl. And I said, what happened to the 2 friends who were drinking the fishbowl? I thought they were your buddies. They weren't going back to college. Well, they got tired and I didn't want to go. Well, that's so much for the buddy system. They were going to be with you so nobody gets hurt. And they would turn to us and say, well, I don't know what happened, but I woke up and I knew if I'd been sober, I would not have brought him home with me. Well, we can't make it up, and we can't ask the jury to guess what happened, what you consented to, how your clothes got off. And those are hugely difficult cases, and we always ended up spending more time investigating those, because I'd say to the young lawyers, you and the detective have to go back to the West End bar. You have to see who paid the bill. How many drinks were there? Did she pay or did the guy pay? What was in the drink? Those cases, they were parties. They were everything from weddings to, sad to say, bar mitzvahs when the kids were 13 years old on a bus coming back from a party. And so those cases could be heartbreaking because you believed something happened that the young woman did not want to happen, but you couldn't prove it. And often that was because there are date rape drugs. There are times when obviously the victim had been given something, and if she was examined promptly, we could prove those cases, difficult to a jury. But if she had voluntarily ingested too much alcohol, too many drugs, we sometimes have to say, I believe you didn't want this to happen, but there's no way we can go into a court of law and prove it.
And the difficulty, of course, being proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very, very high standard. Laws have changed.
Yes.
Where now if I'm going to say woman, but if a victim is even voluntarily becomes intoxicated, that you cannot, in certain places, take sexual advantage of her, therefore sexually assault or rape her, when she is not able to consent. But those are laws of recent times.
And still hard to prove that
Very
unless
hard.
a roommate comes into the room and sees that something's happening and she's not cooperating. And she's not a voluntary participant. So still really tough.
We're right at that 2-minute mark, but if anyone has a question they'd like to ask, Alan Dershowitz in the back.
Oh. Thank you. I think about that because obviously in your role as professor of law at Harvard University, you used your brilliant mind to train a lot of people who became adversaries of mine in cases. And so, so yes, I've come up against that fact. And of course, for me, everything I'd ever written, and there were only 6 novels then by the time I left the office, but boy, would people look for something I said as though it was Linda Fairstein, the prosecutor, who said it, and not Alex Cooper, the fictional character. And I couldn't quite stand up and say, well, members of the jury, that's my fictional voice talking. So absolutely right. I mean, there's, I think juries have learned so much more, but the finality with which these shows end is not real life, and is not the messiness of the clues that don't tie together. So of course you're right. You're Alan Dershowitz. Yes.
A very quick question over there.
So when you see Mariska Hargitay being portraying your character, your profession, do you feel that she does good service to it? Does it seem well written? Does it seem like the acting is good? Or are you ready to throw things at the TV?
I don't watch that much TV, but so Stephanie March was actually the prosecutorial candidate and character, and Mariska the police character. And of course, like I do in my fiction, it's hard for me to make fun because I take liberties and run through, as Rikki said, I'm chased for my character's life through the basements of Rockefeller University. So I know they take liberties, and I think that she's done a lot to show the great work of the women and men of the NYPD, and is a lot of it made up and not real. And I think they've been criticized lately for not showing enough of a dark side of a prosecutor or a police office. So people love the show, and if you take it with a grain of salt, as you take all the crime novels you might read, it's still educated more about these issues than I think procedure shows.
We are out of time. I want to thank you for being here at this hour, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.